I'm a Cam 2 at Alaska Communications, and I am thrilled, Terry Venabert's my name, and I am thrilled to introduce Eden LoveJoy, founder of YourBusinessLifestyle.com. Eden has had a most unusual life, a life that has trained her to think around corners and connect to a wide range of perspectives. Eden will present on the topic of generational divides and their impact on business and culture. And please help me welcome Eden to Alaska Communications and for her time today, and a big warm welcome.
Welcome, Eden. Thank you.
Excited to be here. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Glad to be here today, and thank you for having me at your first hybrid in-person event since ages ago. Great. Yeah. It's helpful to me to be in a room with other humans. The energy, I appreciate it so much. So thanks for coming out, those of you who were able to be here, and welcome to everybody online. It was 17 people online. I don't think we'll go through introductions for everyone today, but I do want to encourage you that you have the ability to ask questions, whatever environment you're in. So wave hands. My hope is that this will be a conversational type of space rather than I'm not going to talk to you for an hour and then walk out the door. I'm looking forward to having some dialogue. So thank you for the nice introduction, Terry. I'm really a small business person, right? That's my background, my craft and inclination. In going to, when I was in school in college, my ideal was to work in small business management, and so that has been my focus my entire career. I help small business owners build businesses that reflect the lifestyle that they would like to live, which is why your business lifestyle. And been doing that in Alaska for a long time. I'll date myself a little bit. I wrote the first small business resource directory for the state of Alaska in 1991 as a college internship project. So that's been my focus. It's been my thing. It's kind of my jam. But in the mid-90s, I was involved in the Construction Trade Association and was at a national convention, and they had somebody come and speak to us about generational perspectives in the construction industry. I mean, you have field technicians and technical people on your teams. You probably have this issue too. As early as the mid-90s, there was this projection of a lack of workers in the field, right? And the construction industry actually has, trades and crafts where the median age is 50 something. If you're a stonemason, at least that was several years ago. And I became fascinated with this topic of the generations and the different perspectives and how to work with them differently. And I will tell you, I have not done this talk in a while. And one of the things that's really interesting about generational looking at the generations is that they change, right? They're always aging and they're always changing. And very shortly, Gen Z, which is leading edge, is 26 years old. It is the largest generation to date, and very soon will be the predominant generation in the workforce. And I'm just learning about that generation myself. But the conversation, for the purposes of today, I want to talk with you first about just the idea of where the value is in thinking about generations and some of the characteristics of thinking about different generational perspectives, right? So the big picture first is so we can look at some of the characteristics of the specific generations that you might be interacting with in the workforce. And candidly, the first time I ever gave this talk, it was to a whole group of baby boomer leaders who were scratching their heads trying to figure out how to work with millennials, right? Over the years, it evolved, and I have definitely given talks to large groups of millennials who are scratching their heads trying to figure out how to work with baby boomers. If you are Gen X, which is that smaller cohort in between, unfortunately, mostly you've been overlooked in terms of the impact your generation has been able to make on the big picture because you just weren't big enough to change the rules, right? So there was a lot of push and pull between baby boomers and millennials over the last 20 years. We know those dynamics have changed. Initially, there were more boomers in the market and less millennials. Now there are more millennials and less boomers. The pandemic has affected that as well. Now we have Gen Z also, and of course the Gen X is in there too. So we'll talk a little bit about the characteristics of each of those generations and how they might play out in the workplace. But more than the specifics of the generations, what I hope that you'll take away from today is an idea that understanding perspectives and how a person's generation and when they are born, the time that they are born in, affects their outlook on life, on relationships, and on the workplace. Because it is different, right? What you grow up with is going to inform what you're up to, the events of your life that you live through. A recent example, the Gen Z, the kids who today have just lived through a pandemic, that will inform their behaviors as adults in ways that we don't yet know or understand. But it is impactful, right? They've lived through an impactful human experience that is going to impact how they look at the world. So one of the things that is interesting, the other thing that's interesting about generations and understanding them is that they change over time, right? So you can't say, well, millennials behave this way because that's the way they behaved when they were 25 or 30. Now they're 40 or 45. Like we all grow up, or at least we mature, we hope. We age. We're going to age. We're still in those, we're aging. Whether we're maturing or growing up, I guess the jury might be out depending on the person. But it does evolve, right? The way a generation is interacting with others is going to evolve. For example, around which of these generations do you think people said there is no way they will ever successfully lead business?
The most recent.
It definitely was said about the baby boomers in the 70s. If you think about the baby boomers in the 60s and the 70s and the way that they were behaving in the days of, peace, love, and go naked, or whatever it was, right? Rock and roll, right? Flower power, all of those things. The traditionalists were looking at that generation saying there is no way on earth this generation will ever be able to lead business, industry, government, culture, right? Like that can't possibly happen. Terry says, and they were right.
Some truth in that.
There's some truth to that. And still, those folks who were young in the 70s did grow into jobs. They became a generation that actually a baby boomer is more likely in the workplace to be a person who just works because they have a work ethic, because it's what you do, it's how you grew up, it's just the thing that you do without like being in the question of why is it important and how is it a value to me or to society, right? Which other generations might have more thoughtfulness around whether or not why they're making a decision to do certain work, right? A baby boomer employee has traditionally been a person who's, like I come in, I go to work because there's work to be done, and so I want to do the very best I can, right? A difference in perspectives of millennials might be, well, why? Why would we do that work? Why is that important? What's the value? And that's not, and so a baby boomer in that conversation might take that as being contrary, like, because I told you so. So we, right? Because I'm your boss, you came onto a job here, I've given you the direction, I need you to do it because that's what we do here, we work, right? That would be a baby boomer mentality. A millennial who has been always raised to understand that their input is important, their perspective is valuable, they have a right to have input into the conversation, might want to understand the context of the conversation that they're in, right? So it's the difference between me, who went to school and got straight A's wherever I could because I thought it was important, and my son, who in the 8th grade, after the end of his 8th grade year, I said to him, how do you think you did? He said, well, I think I did pretty good. I'm curious what happens when you don't do a major project in a class. And I said, well, which major project did you not do in a class? And he said, I didn't do the major project in 8th grade health, this 13-year-old kid. And I said, well, why did you not do the major project in 8th grade health? He said, well, I thought about it. And I could not imagine a time, any time in my life when anyone on the earth would have an opinion about how well I had done in 8th grade health class. And I determined that it wasn't a good use of my time. And I couldn't think of a thing to say. I couldn't think of a thing to say because he was right. But I also was baffled because it's so contrary to my perspective, right? The only thing I could come up with was, yeah, but your teacher just was so excited and she did her best to give you an education and you just, yeah, whatever, he didn't buy it. So different perspectives, right? And that are sort of ingrained in how we are. And when we're working with somebody whose perspective, ingrained perspective, is completely foreign to our ingrained perspective, it can trigger emotional response. Like it can feel oppositional, it can feel personal, it can feel defiant, it can feel unreasonable, right? The millennial who's being asked to do work that is not being explained to them feels like their effort is not valuable, not useful. We had years ago, my daughter brought a friend of hers from college, a boyfriend, home for the summer, and he stayed in our home, and I had gotten him a job with a construction company. And he went to work in that construction company, and there's handouts for people in the back too. You can make sure to get your handout. The instruction that was given to him was to cut, I don't know, 1,000 of these sticks, glass sticks to 3-foot lengths, right? Just here you go, cut these to this length. And he's doing that day in and day out. And pretty boring work, pretty disengaging work, not really very interesting. He was not super motivated to be very accurate, and he got in trouble on the job site. And yelled at, and you got to do it right, you got to do the accuracy. But nowhere along the line did the foreman pause to say to this young man, hey, listen, these are the things that are going to be the forms in which we pour the concrete. And if they're not exactly cut to length, then the concrete won't be level. And the concrete that we're pouring is a foundation for this 5-story building. So what you're doing is important to the integrity of the foundation of this building. Please, could you be thoughtful and cut these to length? And a 30-second conversation to provide some context to a young person who is curious about what their contribution means could make all the difference in their performance. And what it takes is pausing to think about what's driving that person who's in front of me. And it's interesting when you're working with a 50, and I have some background in the construction industry, a 50-year-old plumber who's got a young apprentice. And when that person was an apprentice, the way that the work was done was, shut, carry, jump, just do it. Just be quiet and jump to. That worked when that 50-year-old was 20. But it's not going to work when he's talking with the 20-year-old apprentice today. It's just not. People won't stand for it. They won't. So we have to modify our strategies in order to understand someone else's perspective. Some of the differences over the years. So a couple things, just a little bit of summary things about a general characteristic. Talked about baby boomers and their work ethic. Another thing about baby boomers is that they really grew up in a time where you had to figure it out. If there was a problem to be solved, you had to figure out the steps to solve the problem. The steps to solve the problem might be, in making change, right? You're counting change back so it's exact change. You're doing the actual math to figure out a calculation. You're working through things, right? And that is different from somebody who grew up as a millennial or a Gen Z with technology, right? So the different strategy, if I'm faced with a business problem, I will start to dig in to look at what are the steps of that. Someone who's a Gen Z might say, well, there's got to be an app for that. Let me go research the appropriate tool, right? And just find the appropriate tool. And may or may not ever understand, the steps or care about the steps that are involved in solving their problem. from my perspective, the people who can recognize the strengths of both of those perspectives and invite them to a shared dialogue will have the greatest success, right? There's some value. I mean, again, I'll date myself. When I went to college, they put me in business computing and taught me DOS and WordPerfect. And WordPerfect was the word processor of the day. WordPerfect, you actually do effectively HTML coding. In order to make it bold, you have to do the hashtag, or diagonal backslash B and then end it at the end of the paragraph. Like you're effectively doing HTML coding, and in DOS is still what's behind Windows today, right? You might still at your Windows machine end up with a command prompt, and for me, super valuable, right? I have some tools behind the scenes to be able to see or know that, but a lot of people today would not have a clue about like how to write the HTML code or what to do with the black and white DOS prompt screen in their Windows computer. Is that right? Okay. So strategy of how we solve problems is different. Sense of where our respect is different, right? A baby boomer perspective might be I've got to come in and work my way up the ladder and gain respect. Well, those baby boomers raised a whole bunch of soccer players who were taught their whole lives that everybody's opinion is valuable and everybody's the same and we all count, everybody counts for something. And then they came into the workplace and we got frustrated. I'm sorry, but that's, it's a different perspective. Characteristic of Generation X, if there's one phrase that I think characterizes Generation X, it's thinking outside of the box. I mean, that is a phrase that characterizes that generation that is a smaller cohort, right? The baby boomers, about 74 million. I will tell you that if you look at 10 different resources on understanding generations, you will find 10 different cutoff dates for the years, 10 different numbers for the number of people in that generation, whoever's doing the research, whatever their perspective is. So these are general numbers. They're as good as anybody else's. Go ahead.
Is it true that there is a dip in population of Gen Xers just across the board? Okay, why is that? Just like this.
The baby boomers didn't have that many babies. Right? So the baby boom generation was born right after World War II, and all those boys came home from war, and everybody was glad to be like there was a party going on, and they had a lot of babies. And, but that generation did not have as many children. It just for whatever reason, and so go ahead, Joanne.
What do they call them? Baby boomers.
Why did they call them? Because at the time it was a baby boom. Right there, because that cohort was so large, there were so many babies born in that period. You're like, oh my gosh, it's a baby boom, and then they just became the boomers over time. So what's interesting about Generation X is it is a smaller cohort, and from my perspective, the reason that thinking outside the box is such a characteristic phrase for Gen X is because truly they like. The whole generation is reacting to the box. I mean, this is a generation, if you look at the larger cohorts, you can see how marketing changes, right? So the baby boomers were marketed to with specific tools and resources. That's where we were marketing with, a certain number of contact points. If you hear it 7 times, it'll become real, right? It's repetition. There were certain strategies that provided credibility from a marketing perspective to the baby boomers. Millennials, as they came into the market, became very experiential, and it doesn't matter how many times you tell me if I can't prove it, experience it, feel it, or be referred to it by somebody I already know. So the strategy completely needed to change. It's quite possible that a different marketing strategy would have also worked better for Generation X. Unfortunately, they were so much smaller in terms of numbers in the workplace and in the economy that nobody cared. I mean, really, that they just were unable to drive change in things like marketing, right? Like a classic business case of marketing. Basically, the baby boomers said, "Suck it up, Buttercup. This is how we do it." And the millennials, when they came in as that larger cohort, had to wait a little while, but like now is the time when that millennial generation is leading the change in business and in business dynamics. Does that make sense? So I think that Gen X, they were the latchkey kids. They were independent. They had, creativity of thought. They're definitely like want to do it my way. But thinking outside the box is like a reaction to the box. They're trying to get creative as much as they can, but the box never went away. They could never break down the barrier because they didn't have, as a cohort, the size or space to do that. Still even a smaller cohort in the workplace today, right? Because the millennials came behind. Millennials fully expected to come into the market and be leaders. I was on the board of the Anchorage Chamber of Commerce for a number of years, and literally we were in some conversation one time about what the leadership style or strategy. And one of the younger folks in that conversation said out loud to the room, really, we're just waiting for you guys to get out of our way. And there's a certain sense of, okay, you boomers are pretty well entrenched. You got going on. You've already sort of browbeaten Gen X and not let them get along, let them change anything. But we're here. We're coming. We're just waiting to get enough leverage to like move that out of the way. And I guess that may sound confrontational or oppositional. I don't think that it is. It's just natural, right? It's like we have a different perspective. We have a different perspective, and we want to bring that forward in leadership, and we understand we have to have the capacity. One of the huge things that's occurred recently in the business place is the great resignation. We're talking about being short-staffed for anybody who's working right now is hiring, right? And one of the key drivers for that is that the pandemic triggered a lot of retirement in the baby boomer folks who had continued to be working and then go home from the pandemic and just decided to retire out of the market. And so that's shifted the dynamic. I think there's a lot of people talking about that, trying to figure out the impacts of that, but it is one of the pieces that's affecting us today. Yeah.
Do you think that the dip in available workers would be because there's a low population of that Gen X?
So baby boomers retired and Gen X wasn't big enough, right?
Yeah.
So what's happening now is that of the millennials have a great opportunity, right? So they're moving upward into the market because the space is created. And so a lot of the entry level jobs, you're going to be working with Gen Z, very young people who are just starting to figure things out. So that all of the dynamic and mix is changing. But Gen Z is, this says 72 million. Actually, depending on what you look at, Generation Z is expected to be the largest generation so far. It's definitely coming. And a couple of the articles that I've read preparing for this talk today were suggesting that it's a very short amount of time before that's the largest population of the workforce. Just the way that it's coming. So a couple of other things. Millennials, so 9/11 happened when leading edge of millennials was 5 or 6 years old, pretty young to understand the impact of that event. But that generation, the first generation of people in our country who have lived their entire lives while we have been at war with someone, definitely it's, that is something that's impactful in terms of perspective. The evolution of politics in the country is different today in terms of the dialogue and rhetoric and how people approach argument in a public setting. I think that is impactful for generationally what's happening today and the environment that Gen Z is stepping into from like the more polar extremes than baby boomers were growing up with maybe a more centric sense of compromise. Not that there wasn't opposition, but compromise was more in the dialogue. That's less in the dialogue now. I mean, today in the public view, a lot of the dialogue is more about, let me state my argument and that's it, right? There's not a lot of discourse. So if I just say it loudly enough, then eventually you'll agree with me. Yeah.
The Gen X must have had a lot of babies though.
Gen X had a lot of babies. Yes, they did.
It seemed like the population jumped for the millennials and then a lot of that contribution to the Gen Z. They must have they must have been less people, but had a lot of babies.
I think that, and I have not studied the birth rates piece of it so much. That's not my expertise. Really, I've looked more at what are the impacts in how we navigate dialogue in the business place and how do we motivate, inspire, and our teams. So I don't know the answer to that, but it'd be a fun data point to research.
Yeah.
So that's
What were we doing?
Yes. I was like, people, it's like, well, look at all the people they kind of jump in the workforce. So it was like, that's a pretty big jump.
And again, those numbers can shift depending on what you use as the cutoff year. When I first started looking at this, I was not actually a baby boomer. I was, just the outside of it, kind of a leading edge of Gen X. And because you're a certain age doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to fully identify with one of these generations. Again, it's just informational. The other thing that's different, of course, is the advent of technology, right? I mean, I was 27 years old in college before I got my first computer, and that was one that my mom sent me that was a little Mac with an external floppy disk drive, a 4.5-inch floppy thing that you plug in, and then it did some grinding, and then it spit it out, and you put in the other one, and by the time you got through 3 disks, then you could like edit a document, or and there was no internet, right? That was just a thing. So I saw this thing the other day that was interesting, and it it struck my attention. It was the difference in technology between I guess it would be 1910 and 1975 is the same as the difference between 1975 and today, right? So if you think about that, 1910, horse-drawn carriage, pre-cars, right? Mostly, maybe I don't know, cars coming, but the difference in what technology was available in 1910 to when those of us who were baby boomers were 20 years old in like the 1970s, right? Is about the same as the change from the 1970s to now. Okay? That's a big gap in tools and access and information and all of those things. And so your brain's going to process differently and work differently and think differently. Some of the characteristics of, so we talked about millennials, team players, soccer player generation, right? Everybody's got value, or that's reflected. Gen Z is interesting, right? It's the first fully, I guess millennials are the first fully technology access, but even then, like the leading edge of that, having less technology as children. Gen Z is fully engaged with technology from the time they're 3, right? They're working apps on their parents' phones at 2 and 3 years old. I mean, it's just a part of their living, breathing perspective is access to information and resources and technology. They are also the most diverse generation. So diversity as the country has continued to diversify. So first generation possibly to be really truly colorblind, gender blind. I mean, that, right? It's just people potentially very, very open-minded, very socially conscious. If the Gen Z is coming in as a generation that wants to change the world, right? That sees socially conscious. Millennials and Gen Z are growing up in an environment. The other thing about Gen Z is that they're very security conscious and security focused, which is interesting. So they tend to spend less and conserve more, where millennials maybe are driving the move towards McMansions and the construction, and take on a lot of debt for college and education. Gen Z initial look at that generation suggests that they are less, education is more practical, less focused on a 4-year degree, more focused on what can I do, earn while I, or generate revenue while I'm going through school, getting my education. So there's some shifts there. Less likely to spend for the sake of spending, more conservative in terms of that. So language that will inspire, right? A Gen Z is like, hey, we want to invest in your training, invest in your future, give you a secure future. Those are the kinds of things that could inspire a 20-something, which is kind of unusual to think about from the 20-somethings that we've worked with up until now. Yeah, I'm trying to think. Do we have any questions online? I haven't been watching. I can't see any on here actually.
Yeah. We just had a statement about, World War II, that confirming, that was the period, a huge boom in our economy and population, it's baby boomers. Does anybody have a question within the group online?
Sure to check in.
Yeah.
Questions, comments?
I have a grandson who was born in 2010, so he'd be a Gen Z, and he uses the online mapping system to find, that to the point that he might not be able to find his way if his phone wasn't charged to get him there, right? If something that wasn't very far. So I know that's kind of a liability, but the entrepreneurial where he goes online, buys like great buy on tennis shoes and then resell them for a profit. That he definitely, he probably has like 50 pairs of shoes and he holds them to like sell them for a profit. And he is very like money conscious. He works when he's not going to school. He's going to school to be an RN. And, it's interesting how a lot of this kind of lines up with that. Definitely. So.
It's not interesting when you can kind of see a reflection of a little bit of yourself or of people that you know in the characteristics of the generation. Yeah.
I have a question about, I love this handout. When you talk about schedules, right? Talk about baby boomers being frantic, Gen Xers being aimless, millennials being volatile, and Gen Z being flexible. So I'm a Gen X, right? I'm on the tail end of it. What does that like?
What does that mean?
Yeah.
Aimless in terms of schedule?
Yeah, or even volatile, right? When you're talking, what are you referring to?
Mm-hmm. I think so from the top, baby boomers, when we say frantic, that's like go work, go work, go
This is
work,
what I have
go
to
work,
do.
right? There's that sense of tension. I think the Gen X, aimless, it's more, this is something that I fit around my more important thing, which is my life. And so it's not the most important thing that I do is schedule my work. It's the most important thing that I do is schedule my life. And then I want my work to fit around that and support that. So, and then volatile with millennials, I think, is about shifting, right? That it can change easily, right? Where some people are more likely to get into a routine and then want to keep that and maintain that. Millennials are much more open to like, oh, well, I was doing that this week, but now I'm doing that, and now I've changed, or my life has changed, so we're going to change the schedule, right? Looking to move around more and have more of a shift. And then Gen Z, the flexibility of that is, again, if the socially conscious focus is there, if I'm motivated, it's there, or otherwise work is hard. And so I have an employee, I have she's totally Gen Z, and she's 19 or 20, right? Young and trying to find her way into being an employee in an industry that a personal care company. So we're sending caregivers out into people's homes a couple of hours at a time, right? And some of the conversations here, right? Like one day she called and she said, well, my phone's out of power, so I can't go to my job. And I said, well, I can give you driving directions, right? I'm a person who thinks about driving directions. It's like 3 turns from where you are. It's like 15 miles, but it's 3 turns. You could write it down and you could get there from here. And she went that day, but it was so stressful, right? Like if I don't have my phone, I can't find my way in the world is definitely a thing. For her to say, you know, hey, my car's not working today, so I'll let you know when I get it fixed, and call back 3 weeks later and say, you know, hey, it took a while to figure out, but I'm ready to go back to work. It's a mindset. It's a 20-year-old mindset. Can you put me back on the schedule, right? But any barrier, anything that makes it difficult, my technology, my family wants me to go on a 3-week vacation. They just told me yesterday, but I'll be back next month, right?
Yeah.
They're very flexible.
So with the pandemic, that the Gen Z, because I have a few nephews who were, as an example, you know, why would I go to work at this wage and not, you know, and not just not work, right?
Right.
And collect, I'm getting paid more when I'm not working. Like, is that part of that?
Well, I think that's a part of both the millennial and the Gen Z, right? What's the value? What's the trade-off? So the question, can everybody hear when other people are speaking, or should I restate the question?
They can
Yes,
hear.
we can
Okay.
hear you.
Yeah, you got good.
They're all muted, and there's quite a few. There's 27 or something on there. So everybody's listening. They're just being polite, being muted. Yeah, yeah.
I just want to make sure everybody can hear. I should have good pickup. So
Yeah.
that's great. So I'm sorry, the question.
No, we were talking about, you know, that kind of mentality where, you know, why would I go to work? You know, kind of the value there. That sort of shocked me, being a Gen Xer, I guess, that was.
Well, it's so you have a value judgment around the source of your revenue that they don't have,
Okay.
right? So your value judgment is I should generate income to cover my expenses. Their perspective is, hey, this income is available to me. I mean, I could go here and work, or I could go over here and receive this income. This seems more valuable, and I have more flexibility with my time. So,
yeah.
And I think so the other part of the employment shift that we're dealing with in the Great Resignation is that there are so many people stepping out to say, I just want to do my own thing. I'll go be entrepreneurial. I'll drive. You know, I don't know how many Uber drivers or Lyft drivers there are in the world, but there's a lot, and they generate enough on their own schedule, their own time, right? Totally flexible, and work when I want and don't if I don't. So just a different mindset. Yeah, very different mindset. And I think the thing that I want to encourage you is to not have a judgment about the difference, but be an observation about the difference.
Mm-hmm.
Learn about the difference, and then find the language that can inspire and you got to be. I think you have to be ethical about that. So I would not encourage you to go figure out how somebody thinks so I can game them into doing exactly what it is that I want. I think the ethical space of it is figuring out how somebody else thinks, or a generation thinks, and discovering what are the strengths of that, right? So that, like, if you have a generation that's inspired by social consciousness, and we can add a social consciousness component, it's good for the business, it's good for the community, it's good for the team, and we get more loyal people, right? Not, but you want to be truthful about it, right? Really create something that's socially impactful, not just give it lip service in order to try to motivate people to do what it is that you want them to do. And I think from every perspective, we tend to approach it as if our perspective is the right perspective, right? So you almost, I would encourage you to take right and wrong out of the equation. Right? And certainly the baby boomers for a very, very, very long time got away with understanding what was right and driving that show. The baby boomers who are still in the market are no longer the majority, and so let's let go of that. Let's go with that story that there's only one right way to be, one right way to have a work ethic, one right way to have a work performance, and really get clear about maybe there's something to these new ideas, right? How do we motivate and inspire people and get highest productivity? And just to seek to look at it from someone else's perspective, different tools, different resources, different strategies, not better than or worse than, not less than or more than, just different. That's really what I hope people will hear when we're talking about the generations.
Does anybody out online have any questions or comments that they'd like to put out?
I have a quick question for you, Eden. Thanks for speaking to the group. I'm curious. I honestly have never. This is such a great talk, and it's so informative to kind of identify and recognize these generational divides in attitude and values. I'm curious how you got into this. Like, what led you to see this as being something with merit? It really is, and I've just never heard anyone bring this up before as like a as a topic. But I love it, and I'm curious.
Yeah, I was at a workshop many years ago, and someone brought this topic to that workshop. And I just got fascinated by it. I thought there's something here, right? There's something here about understanding. So it turned out, I mentioned that I guess maybe it resonated with me because internally, as I've like learned about myself over the years, what I really love to do is I really love to help people get what they want out of their life, right? To live the life that they want, whether they're business owners or employees. And so this piece of how can we be more effective by understanding each other in life just resonated with me. And it was brought to me in a workshop like this, and I just picked it up and said, I want to learn more, and went out and learned more. And then because I am who I am, it's like, well, if I want to learn about it, I'm going to let people know I have some information, maybe I can share it. It is interesting preparing for this. So I've not given this talk in probably 5 years. And 5 years ago, Gen Z was, 20 and not really a player in the workplace so much. So to prepare for this, I'm like, there's a whole other generation now I gotta think about.
And a whole other pandemic that happened,
And
right?
well, the pandemic that happened to me too.
Do you think that will have an impact? And if so, I mean, obviously it will, but I would think that Gen Z, not that, yeah, we went through this thing, maybe, I don't know.
I don't think anybody knows. I think that when people are studying and looking at where to cut the line for different generations, generally it's about 20 years, right? About 20 years from childhood to when you're in childbearing range, right? That's when we make a cohort. But, people who are, I would expect that this cohort, this Gen Z, will either be broken up into two categories, like before pandemic, aware of the pandemic or not aware of the pandemic, or they'll find a different categorization, right? Because people who are already on the planet experiencing, maybe school age kids who were affected by being removed from community and lived those 2 years of the pandemic are going to have an impact in that cohort of people. So it might be a narrower year definition because the event impact is so high, right? So you have to balance that as well. You can't expect that somebody who grows up never knowing a pandemic experience will necessarily have the same outlooks, perspectives, tools, and strategies as somebody who did go through that. So it'll be interesting to see.
Very.
Again,
Colonials.
what's
Colonials?
Colonials.
Oh, colonials. There you go. I like that.
It's kind of funny because like baby boomer, somebody asked where they got that name. It was adopted, and then Gen Y, somebody put a letter on it. So now we're Gen XYZ, right? Or Gen X was the first one, and then Gen XYZ. There is, for the babies being born today, an alpha generation. So I don't know if the idea is now how do they make up the names? Yes. And one of the things that I thought was interesting about millennials, as I've given this talk over the years, and it's somewhere in the handout, it might talk about like the open-mindedness. And so really over the years, as I was looking at the dynamics principally between boomers and millennials, one of the big differences for me was flexibility of thought. That baby boomers tend to be very concrete, again, walking through, things in a process, and that things have a have a right and a wrong. They have a way that's the right organizational structure, a way to be. And the example that I used was one day, again, walking with my son. My son's a really great teacher in my life. And he was maybe 16, and we were walking and saw a poster of a hand with a new, a premature infant in a man's hand. And I looked at the poster and I said, what a tiny baby. He said, or a really big hand. And it just struck me like the flexibility of thought, that it's not just one way, right? That a real power and strength of the millennial generation that I think is probably carrying forward through Gen Z is this flexibility of thought, right? This diversity of thought, because possibly because new math is different, right? There's 5 ways to get to a solution, and whatever your opinion is about it, I don't understand it personally at all, but it does give people alternate ways to get to solutions, right? Versus those of us who grew up with just this is the right way to do it. And so where the baby boomer brings this process mindset that can be really valuable and help create a framework for things, the flexibility of thought can really bring a lot of creativity. And when we can balance those things and look for strengths rather than oppose each other, we'll thrive.
Eden, I have a question. Actually, kind of a statement too. I am a baby boomer, and I have millennial children, and they have been driving me crazy over the years because my oldest would get a new job every 6 months because they weren't fulfilling her needs. And I was like, you're gonna run out of places to work. I'm all worried. She's like, no, well, I'll figure it out. And they like to say, when I'm having problems with my phone and can't figure out a setting or whatever, they're like, okay, boomer. Oh. And one of them told me the other day, she's 33, she says, I am not taking a minimum wage job. I'm not even going to take a job that pays me less than 20 an hour. They're just going to have to buck up if they want to pay me. If they want to hire me. And I'm just astounded by this. Because my first job was $1.75 an hour, and it was peeling apples. Like, how do you have that attitude? So cavalier, but it's working for them.
Well, right now, nationally, our unemployment rate is like 3.6%.
Yeah.
So they can.
Yes.
And unless and until that changes, the employee has a lot of power right now. Right. They have a lot of power to drive the dialogue, and it just is the environment that they're in, and that's different from the environment that we were in as young adults at 30-something.
And then when that comes all to a halt, because it has to, right?
Well, one could hope, right? I don't know. I guess we'll see how it unfolds, right? Yeah, you have to wait and see. Certainly things will change over time, and will that generation always be able to drive their wage to that extent? I don't know, right? Right now is a unique time. There's shortages of goods. There's a lot of a unique scenario. But someone who's capitalizing on that and saying, hey, my value is such that I'm gonna earn this. There's room for that, right? As long as how long they keep that job, right, might depend on performance, and but that changing every 6 months, that volatile, kind of volatile, easy come, easy go. It's not about loyalty. It's about making sure to take care of my family and my life. But again, what's driving me crazy about it is the judgment, because
I know.
Well, so yeah, let go of the judgment and you'll be fine.
Mine was kind of the same type of that, because I'm like Generation X, but I'm like right on the cusp, and my husband is a definite baby boomer. And we have 4 kids. They're all millennials, and they're kind of the opposite though, and I don't know if that's because like they stay on like for a long time. And I don't know if that's because that they've had like both. Like I'm more kind of like just kind of fly by the seat of my pants, right? My husband's very structured. He works. I work too, right? And I work very hard. But he is very rigid. He will stay in a job that is maybe he deserves way more, right? But he stays and he likes to run the show. And I mean, it's just like he was very different as a parent than I was. I was kind of the opposite. And I don't know if maybe some of that played a role, but it seemed like the millennials, some of the millennials, maybe it's the Gen X that's coming out now, that it is a bit more that they're not as loyal. I mean, their loyalty is to themselves, right? It's not like I'm grateful to have a job. They pay me for what I'm worth, but they're more focused on what am I getting out of it, right? Am I getting enough out of it for my time? Where me, just as a Gen X, I wouldn't have liked.
Yeah, so it is a different perspective,
Yeah.
right? It's definitely a different perspective and more, so we have to motivate differently. So as business leaders, where we used to be able to say, here's the job, do the job, here's the salary, we'll compensate for the salary, right? In this market, you can't, my theories, right? I can't regulate people into right action. I can't direct or force them into right action. When we're working, especially with millennials and Gen Z, I have to inspire them to right action, right? I have to create an environment that it touches their heart, that inspires them for something they care about that's bigger than the job. And that's different generationally than the baby boomer or possibly even the Gen X. I got a hand up here and one online. Let's go online first.
Yep. So we have Teresa asked numbers around millennials that still live at home with their baby boomer parents. What does that look like?
You know what? I don't know the answer to that. I know that there's definitely trends, and I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that, but we've definitely seen trends of people who stay home or come back home and are at home longer. That's a piece that I had some judgment around. And then one day my husband said, yeah, I don't know how they do it nowadays as young people, right? With the college debt that they have and the earnings to expense ratio and what it takes to actually buy a home. Like the only way they can get there is sometimes to live as family. So I don't know what the percentage or numbers are, but it's definitely different than like the traditionalists, right? Where you turn 18 and you got a suitcase for your birthday.
Right.
Terry.
This has been so interesting, Eden. Thank you so much. We're running like up to the clock almost, 3 or 4 minutes left. And I was just hoping you could tell us a little bit more about your business and some of the other seminars or teachings that you do, and just give us a little bit more perspective on that.
Oh, well, thank you. So it stumped me, right? I should be able to talk about myself without having to fill that with filler comments. You introduced me with an eclectic background. I grew up, my background in San Francisco in the 70s, raised by a hippie mom. I have been exposed to, by the time I was 16, a multitude of world religions, and I went to 16 different schools, all alternative schools mostly. I think 2 public schools and the rest were private, alternative, whatever. And the rules changed all the time. It was really chaotic. So a piece of what I'm up to is helping small business owners bring real clarity and alignment to their teams, right? To bring in the small business environment or on teams within larger business environments to move out of chaos and into clarity, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have a lot of teams where everybody's focused on one person and everything kind of looks like this. How do we bring in delegated authority, accountability, and responsibility so that we have a more organized culture and people are able to perform and they also know what the rules are, right? Rather than being more recently as my work is evolving. So it turns out I'm also very entrepreneurial. I have 6 businesses that I am a principal in or own right now. And so depending on which business we're talking about, but the overarching theme and what ties them all together is about supporting people in, fulfilling their dreams in their life. Whether it's senior citizens who want to stay in their home and we want them to be happily in their homes for as long as they like, or small business owners who want to organize their team so that they can go on vacation and sleep well while they're out of town. All of the work that I do is about supporting people in fulfilling their goals and objectives. That's helpful. So I haven't been doing any talks for the last few years, but I do a lot of talks on mission, vision, values, building a high-performing culture in companies. That's been my primary topic of community engagement, is building high-performing culture in teams and in business.
I would think that this is like a prime time with
Yeah.
the evolving of how it used to be, and then this like March of 2020, everything changed, and then trying to piece everything. It's like, what's like the new normal? I bet that is a heavy lead right now for a lot of businesses.
There's, and for me, like for everybody else, right? There's two different ways that people have made it through the pandemic. Either one being really, really challenged and shut down and not having access to any resource to fulfill their mission, or two, being completely compressed and having more work than they know what to do with. Right? Yeah. So there is a lot out there. Any other from the?
We have a lot of compliments. One of our attendees is thanks you. Excellent questions. She was grateful to attend the speaking engagement. I think if you guys want to come off mute and just give some thanks or whatnot.
Yeah,
please.
we can wrap this up. Eden, thanks so much. Hope you get to enjoy some lunch, and
There's one.
we appreciate you spending some time with our group. We will all keep you in mind for anyone that's looking for some help to develop the lifestyle that they want. So thank you.
Whether they're internal teams or external teams, right?
Yep.
Absolutely. That is the work that I do. And thank you for having me. And you all online, you missed what looked like a really great lunch. So
Don't be jealous, guys.
thank you.
Thank you all very, very much.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.